A few years ago, I reconnected with the father of a high school friend whom I hadn't seen in almost 2 decades. Partway through the conversation, he stopped. "I'm so disappointed in you," he said. "When you were in high school, we all thought that you were going to grow up and do amazing things with your life. How is it that you ended up being just a teacher?" Just. When I was in high school, I shared a profile that had much in common with many of our high-achieving students here today. I was in all AP and honors classes. My friends and I competed in standardized testing for fun, and I was beyond overcommitted in my non-school hours between dance and theater and band and choir and a whole mess of clubs and history day and an internship in the state senate. I'm not really sure where I found time to sleep. When I was in elementary school, someone once asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I said I wanted to be a teenager. But by the time I was in high school, my sights had shifted. My new goal was to be nothing less than the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I look back now and I find that humorous, but at the time, no one really said anything to dissuade me from the idea that this was something that I could achieve. We did have one family friend who was a distinguished professor and chair of history at a university, and he told me at one point my senior year that I would make a good teacher or professor. He told me, it's okay to bloom where you're planted. Sometimes the things that are most special are those that are seemingly ordinary. I smiled and thanked him, but 17-year-old me on the inside, I laughed. It all felt a little too, there's no place like home for me. And I have the semi-rural suburbs with cows behind our high school felt a little too much like Kansas. I had my sights set on a school in Washington, D.C. If I was going to bloom, it wasn't going to be in some ordinary way that people around me expected. I was going to write my own story. It was going to be an epic worthy of a history book. And if I was going to bloom, it was going to be far, far away from home. The reality of actually paying for my dream school shifted my sights a little bit. And as I looked at my options, I decided that the best place to plant myself was at UC Davis. It was only 40 minutes from home, and there were still so many cows. And yet, it was the perfect fit for me. While I was there, I shifted my focus from constitutional law to international relations, and I made friends with some amazing people. Like we had in high school, we still sat around watching Animaniacs and Pinky and the Brain, and many of my friends were concocting schemes for how they were going to take over the world. But my schemes were a little bit different. I wanted to figure out how it was that I could change the world and make it a better place. But how does one set out to change the world? When I was young, my father told me that one day he thought I was going to do great things, just like President Kennedy. It can be incredibly exhilarating and yet so much pressure to have the people you love expect such greatness from you. I looked around at world leaders that I admired, and I found that one thing that many of them had in common was that they had dedicated their lives to service to others. And President Kennedy once said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." The great thing about that storyline is you don't have to set out to be great. You set out to make the world great for someone else. I thought I had found my path. I was going to go out and join the Peace Corps. I was going to have them send me to some remote corner of the world, and I was going to work on youth development, because youth, after all, are our future. I got my application all ready, and there was one thing I hadn't quite considered on this path. I'm asthmatic, and the government is truly not interested in sending an asthmatic halfway around the world to rural West Africa where there are no hospitals. Sometimes reality is really good at raining on your parade, but that's okay, because it takes rain to make flowers grow. I shifted my focus. I was still convinced that my story was going to be epic, and I was going to replant myself far, far away from livestock. It turns out a horse had a slightly different plan for me. I was riding my senior year, and I was thrown hard. I nearly broke my neck. I suffered a moderate to severe concussion, and things that had once been easy for me were now incredibly difficult. I had to relearn much of the normal pieces of life that I already knew. And as I was looking at graduate school programs, I decided that maybe it was a better idea to plant a little closer to home again. I did manage to change the smell of cows for a sea breeze, though. I planted myself at the Monterey Institute for International Studies, and I decided to focus on post-colonial development. If the Peace Corps wasn't going to send me halfway around the world, I was going to find a way to send myself. While I was at MISS, I had the opportunity to work under some absolutely amazing professors, people who were not only teaching and researching, but out in the world, making it a better and safer place for all of us. And I found them inspiring. One of my favorite professors was from my seminar on ethics and the use of force. And while I was in his class, I had the opportunity to travel to Britain for a conference, but also to conduct some research. I was able to get access to the British Library and to the archives in the city of Coventry. When I came back, I presented my paper with my original research, and he pulled me aside afterwards. Faith, I'm not sure that you're meant for the world of public policy, but you would be absolutely amazing in my job. There it was, teaching again. But this time my reaction had changed. Instead of laughing, I was flattered. To be a teacher and a researcher and a game changer like my mentor, that sounded pretty amazing to me. And I started researching doctoral programs. During this whole time, I was also working as a graduate research assistant at the Center for Nonproliferation Studies on chemical and biological weapons terrorism. And during that time, I learned more than I truly ever wanted to know about people's capacity to create things for the sole purpose of killing, destroying, and terrorizing other human beings. For a girl who was focused on changing the world, it seemed like a pretty good place to start. So I added a secondary focus to my master's degree on nonproliferation. It was the secondary focus, even whilst I was conducting my independent study research for my thesis on post-apartheid South Africa, that led me to my first job outside of graduate school. I was offered a position as a chemical weapons convention analyst for the SAIC, working on US compliance. I was finally going to move across the country. I decided that my PhD could wait. I packed everything that I could fit into my little Toyota Celica, and I drove all the way across the country to Abingdon, Maryland. I skipped a slide. It wasn't quite Washington, D.C. There were actually a lot of horses and cows and hay, but it still felt like I was on my way. My position included reporting on U.S. compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or OPCW. A lot of my work was clerical in nature, but I did get to travel around the country helping to fulfill our mission. At one point, I was sharing a presentation that I was ghostwriting for one of my superiors. We were all set to go to a conference on disarmament in The Hague, and we were going to serve in support roles. I get partway through the presentation, and he stops me. "Why don't you just do it for me?" Wait, what? "You do it better than I do. Can you just do it for me?" Me? I'm 24 and a girl, and you want me to go present on U.S. compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention in The Hague. Okay. Bloom where you're planted? How about bloom where you plant yourself? It felt like one of those mountaintop experiences and that I had finally arrived. We flew to The Hague and it was magical. My presentation was on the first night and it went exactly the way I had planned. Everyone applauded, my team congratulated me, and we go into the reception that first night and I am flying high. I have just represented our country on the world stage at 24. The first several people who talked to me wanted to talk policy, and it felt like an amazing turning point in my story. And it was, just not the way I had anticipated. Later that night, like so many women in public policy, I found myself the subject of an experience that was embarrassing and humiliating, degrading, and ultimately devastating. The subject of my own Me Too moment. The rest of the conference passed in a blur, me trying to regain my roots and figure out what was going on. We flew home, and I struggled with finding a new purpose in my work. People around me assured me, well, this is just how things happen. Don't you know that girls elevated so high, so young, that everyone assumes that they got there by just one way? It's how men in power work. Aren't you lucky that it wasn't worse? Questions circulated in my head. Just because it's always worked that way, why does that mean we have to accept it? Farmers change the soil to make flowers grow. Why can't people change society? Are we actually the authors of our own story? Or are we just pawns acting on a stage with a play that was written centuries ago? I had a choice to make. I could stay silent and stay where I was. I could work from within the organization for change, or I could find some other way to create a society that was more equal and equitable for all. But in reality, the status quo was never an option for me. As I was trying to figure out what was going on, life intervened. While I was working, I'd gotten married for the first time, and my husband and life took me out of that position and across the ocean, finally, to Morocco. I was finally free of cows, but it still made me smile to see donkeys pulling carts in the street and goats climbing trees. While I was in Morocco, I shifted my focus and I started teaching English. One of the first positions I had was teaching the staff at the ambassador's residence. I was teaching the cook and the maids and the gardeners their fourth language. They all already spoke Arabic and French. A few of them spoke Spanish and some of them spoke Berber. And as we were working, I found that one of the women I was working with could neither read nor write in any of those languages. So I changed my position a little bit. I didn't just teach her fourth language. I taught her how to read. And then something amazing happened. One of the gardeners felt encouraged and inspired, and he taught her how to read in her first language, Arabic. And then I saw it. Happy tears can help flowers bloom too. I was offered a full-time position at the American School, and it took me out of my other positions. But it was an absolute joy to teach the children of the international community. They were the children of ambassadors and other diplomats, of foreign service workers, of non-governmental organizations. Some of them were wealthy Moroccans. A few were royalty, and there was one who was the grandchild of an exiled African dictator. But whoever I was teaching, I found that in so many ways, I was fulfilling that dream that I had of joining the Peace Corps and working on youth development. When we returned to the United States, I decided not to re-enter the world of public policy. I did what that high school friend had recommended. I got my teaching credential, and I started teaching history. It turns out you don't have to travel halfway around the world to be of service to others. You can be of service to others right in your own backyard. I think maybe my high school APUSH teacher had it right. Well, very different from mine, he found an indirect path to the classroom. His story is not mine to share, but there's one piece that has always sat with me. He told us that, well, teaching was not his original dream. At some point, reality dictated and required that he change his focus to changing the world right in front of him. And for each of us, that meant that he met us where we were, even when he disagreed with our stances, and encouraged us to always be better. And then he set us out to write our own stories. My friend's dad, he had it wrong. I will never be just a teacher. Like so many of my distinguished colleagues, I do teach history, but I also teach so much more. I give students the tools that they need to propel them on their journey. I teach students to challenge the world around them. I challenge my students to work for a world that is more equitable and equal, and to treat others with respect and dignity. I challenge them to stand up for themselves and for others who have been wronged. I challenge them to write their own story, not the story that someone else would write for them. So where did my dreams lead me? Exactly where I planned, even if my dreams took a little bit different path. I might still go get that PhD someday, but even if I don't, I can be a game changer right here. Baby Glinda the Good Witch was right after all. For me, there's no place like home. And sometimes it's okay to bloom where you planted. I may not change the world for everyone, but by being of service to others, I can change the world for those in front of me. And that could create a ripple effect that changes the world. I may never live to see it, but it's not going to stop me from trying. So go out. Find your own path and write your own story. I can't tell you how that story will end because it's yours to write, not mine. Find what makes you passionate. And remember that the things that we love sometimes reappear in different forms. Plant some roots. Remember that cows and rain help flowers grow. And then bloom where you're planted. But change the soil. Grow your garden and write your story. You never know. You just might end up changing the world. Thank you.